This is the Miller philosopher. So as beloved as the Lord of the Rings trilogy is, there are some points that are considered extremely controversial to some fans. Often they are called purists because of their insistence that any adaptation of Tolkien stories must adhere to the literature. And this is the perception among many such fans across many other franchises as well. This isn't a strictly Lord of the Rings experience. And the biggest one I came across, even back when the movies were out, was the portrayal of the relationship between Faramir and the One Ring. That is, that in the books, there is no relationship between Faramir and the One Ring because Faramir outright rejects the ring, whereas the movie shows him as being more corrupted by it before finally rejecting it. Now, if you're a fan of Faramir, as many people are, this is unforgivable, and I understand that. Some might even see it as on the level of Rings of Power's portrayal of Second Age Galadriel, if I'm being honest. So after doing my little project on the Lament of Boromir a couple weeks ago, I felt inspired to look more closely at this issue. And I came across a Reddit post where the author posits a theory that the reason why Faramir and Tom Bombadil, which I'm not going to go into, not being tempted by the One Ring wasn't a quote-unquote plot hole, was that the ring had decided that Faramir wasn't even going to Mordor in the first place, whereas Frodo and Boromir were. Therefore, it just made more sense to pretty much stick with the people who are going in the direction that you're going in already, rather than go through all the trouble of seducing another person to change your mind and then go down to Mordor to go back to your master. Essentially, it didn't really make sense to try and turn someone who wasn't in your best interest in the first place. Now, a lot of people during this post had their own interpretations of it. Some even posited that Faramir was tempted, but turned away much quicker than his brother and his movie incarnation did. Now, all of them, on all the sides, made good points, but the only way I thought to resolve this for myself was to look at the text itself and then leave out any biases, essentially taking a scientific point of view of it and going strictly by the evidence of what was there, not what I wanted to believe one way or the other. And this is what I came across in the Book of the Two Towers. I apologize if my quotation of this is kind of bad, but bear with me. Quote, "But fear no more. I would not take this thing if it lay by the highway, not were Minas Tirith falling in the ruin, and I alone could save her. So by using the weapon of the Dark Lord for her good and my glory. No, I do not wish for such triumphs, Frodo, son of Drogo." End quote. And there it is. Faramir's rejection of the One Ring, just like people have said. Very blunt, very to the point, very concrete, and very authentic. Now, I decided to read further, and on page 889, Sam lets spill to Faramir in a moment of recklessness what exactly that his master was carrying. Quote, "Now look here, sir." He turned up to Faramir with all the courage he could muster. "Don't you go taking advantage of my master, because a servant's no better than a fool. You've spoken very handsome all along, put me off my guard talking of elves and all. But handsome is as handsome does, as we say. Now's a chance to show your quality." "So it seems," said Faramir, slowly and very softly with a strange smile. "So that is the answer to all the riddles. The One Ring that was thought to have perished from the world. And Boromir tried to take it by force, and you escaped, and all the way to me. And here in the wild I have you, 2 halflings and a host of men at my call, and the Ring of Rings. A pretty good stroke of fortune. A chance for Faramir, captain of Gondor, to show his quality. Ha!" He stood up very tall and stern, his gray eyes glinting. End quote. Now, the hobbits get scared after this moment and get ready to defend themselves, because no one in the cave knows what's going on, because he had this conversation with them in private, but they all kind of saw what was going on. And at this point, he seemed to be kind of acting strange to them, and no one was quite sure. But Faramir then laments his brother for not being able to pass this trial, and recalls his own words about not using Isildur's Bane, even if it were found along a highway, and that he alone could use it to save Gondor. Faramir acknowledges that he was not aware of the weight of what he had said at the time, but decided to hold it as a vow, thereby reinforcing his rejection of the One Ring. Now, sorry for the lengthy read, but I wanted to give the text a chance to speak for itself before I went into my own thoughts. There was one other thing, though, that I wanted to check after reading this, and that was the extent of the powers of the One Ring itself. Because this is the One Ring of Sauron, this is supposed to be the ultimate evil in Middle-earth lore. So, what's the deal? Now, from what I could find, it enhanced the natural abilities of the user and was capable of low-key telepathy to seduce even those around it to serve its own purposes. That this power was an extension of Sauron himself, and Sauron being a master of deception and seduction, as shown by his seduction of Baron's comrade during the First Age, as well as a mastery of power of words as shown in his battle with Finrod, and, depending on which version you want to go with, is said by some people to have been used during the seduction of Numenor as well. Even other Maiar were not immune to its power, as was the case with Gandalf. In essence, that the only way to overcome the One Ring's will was to be someone who was extremely mentally strong, had mastered their own self through intense discipline and training, and most importantly, was very, very spiritually mature. So, what was my conclusion? Well, based on the evidence, I would say that Faramir was tempted, but did quickly recognize not to fuck with it, just like some people have said. My reasoning being this, that at first, he doesn't even know that Isildur's Bane and the One Ring are the same thing in the beginning. He assumes that it was some sort of powerful artifact, hence why he casually makes the comment and rejection about leaving it by the highway, which is what most people refer to. Second, being that Faramir is intently focused on getting information about Isildur's Bane from the hobbits for a long time. He had dreams about it, yes, but he almost seems to dog the issue, though he's wise enough not to really press them on it while others are around or paying attention. It can be argued that the death of his brother was tied to it, and therefore that would be why, but even then he only discovers the circumstances surrounding his brother and the One Ring while pressing him about the object itself, and again, still not quite sure what the object was. Thirdly, is that it seems to me that his method of trying to get the information was quite honestly very low-key Sauron-ish, if you get my meaning. Not in terms of malice, but how direct questioning won't work with these guys. Both hobbits were prepared to die to maintain the secret, so torture probably wasn't going to work anyway. So instead, he bides his time, using off-site comments and casual discussion to lower their guard and discuss other matters in and around Isildur's Bane without going into Isildur's Bane itself. That's how he finally wormed that information out of Sam. Recall also that the ring's power included enhancing one's own native abilities and subliminally seducing others. And the text doesn't explicitly say this, but it could be interpreted that this is what happened with Faramir, whom was already extremely intelligent and just had that enhanced in order to get that information out. And most importantly, that the ring was an extension of Sauron's nature. It was these very methods, after all, that Sauron had used to so much success across 2 whole ages. So, from that point of view, an interpretation that Faramir did experience some form of temptation, even momentarily, is plausible. And lastly, the final thing that convinced me was how the book describes Faramir's reaction after finally discovering the Hobbit's secret. Yes, he took and made a promise before, but it was an absent-minded one by his own admission, and one that he only then afterwards made into a binding oath, according to the text. Everyone in the cave wasn't sure, as I said earlier, what he was going to do, and he seems to almost let this play out. Even the description, now calling him, quote, tall and stern with glittering gray eyes, seems to heavily imply that something is going on in his head that he's not saying. This wasn't a clear-cut, no, the One Ring is evil, I am not going to touch it. Not yet. There's at least a few seconds of thought before he finally makes that decision, it seems like. This doesn't take anything away from his character for me either, which is what a lot of people were concerned about with the movie's portrayal of Faramir. That somehow by showing him being tempted, it made his character and his integrity and dignity lesser, which was supposed to be a very big deal in the books. And to me, that wasn't the case. In fact, if anything, I think the movie did an excellent job portraying this particular part of the story, with the exception that, yes, they did draw that out a little bit with the whole journey back to Gondor and the attack by the race and whatnot. And it wasn't an issue for me as well because of the nature of the One Ring itself. It's an extension of the will of the most powerful spirit and Maiar in Middle-earth, who was older than time itself and has deceived both immortals and mortals for just as long. Can it be resisted? Yes, as shown by the hobbits and Faramir, and Tom is a strange level oddity unto himself, so I exclude that character. But for the others, it still eventually finds a way to worm into their thoughts and overwhelms them, or at least starts to, because of the final component needed to master it, mastery of spiritual development. While it's weird to say that a spirit self lacks spiritual development, the fall of Melkor, Sauron, Ungoliant, and the Balrogs does show that this is absolutely possible. The spirit itself doesn't automatically make that particular character omnipresent, fully mature, or altogether completely moral. Therefore, why would one lone mortal ranger of Gondor somehow be an exception to this particular rule, even when the ring bearers were not? It's Faramir's humility and integrity, that mental discipline that I mentioned earlier, that helps him recognize these things, and thus he cuts it off before it can get into his head and tempt him any further. And again, regarding the movie's portrayal, I do think it does lean more heavily into this aspect of the temptation, while the books don't, hence the debate and arguments. But both versions still arrive at the same outcome. Faramir in either version is not a mentally weak character or a physically weak character. He shows his quality, but he's also going up against a force that is older than time itself. And therefore, I think just the very fact that he was able to acknowledge his limitations as a mortal and not knowing the full powers of what he's going to be fucking with, one version or the other, shows just how spiritually developed he was, even for a mortal. But having said all that, let me know your thoughts below, and this is the Miller Philosopher. Have a good day.